All right, thank you all for coming to the last Asian Studies Colloquium of the fall term. I'm Rob Foster, I'm in charge of the Asian Studies program, and tonight we have the delight of welcoming back a Berea alum. Many of you may know Jared from years ago, and many of you may know him from just the past couple of years. Jared graduated from Berea in 2004. I still can't believe it was that long ago. And after being at Berea, he went on to Bangalore, India, where he helped co-found TutorVista.com, which was an online tutoring service. He was the founding academic director for this company, which eventually sold for $230 million in 2011. So he's very familiar with a number of different pedagogical methods. Those of you who've been in his classes have probably appreciated some of the interesting things that he's brought up. But eventually he saw the light and went back to school. And he enrolled at the University of Hawaii, where he received his master's degree in philosophy. And he will be defending his doctorate this coming April, and will soon be Dr. Brown. His research interests are in Buddhist and Indian philosophy and the philosophy of Islamic law. He's also traveled extensively in South and Southeast Asia, as well as having practiced bunraku puppetry in Japan. He's a very well-traveled gentleman. And I don't know how many of you attended Kelly Williams's talk last year. He's a person who also graduated from Berea College and now works for Big Ass Fans. And one of the things that Kelly said was, make sure you learn languages. That was one of the key things he said to students who said, what should we do to prepare for life after Berea? He said, learn foreign languages. And Jared has certainly taken that to heart. He is proficient in Indonesian Malay, in Khmer, in Middle Khmer, in Sanskrit, and Pali. So he brings a wide arsenal of languages to the various interests that he has. He's also a very wide-ranging scholar. He's done a lot of work in South Asian philosophy, but also very contemporary issues, such as the violence that is now affecting Myanmar and Thailand. He is currently teaching Buddhism and the religions of South and Southeast Asia. In the spring, he will teach 2 sections of GSTR 210 and Philosophy 106, Introductory Reasoning. Nice plug right before registration. And he is currently also organizing, the Buddhist Studies Reading Group this fall. And in the spring, he'll be organizing a Hindu Studies Reading Group as well. So please join me in welcoming Jared Brown.
Minglaba and Assalamu alaikum. I'm so glad that so many of you all were able to turn out. And I hope that I don't disappoint you today, because perhaps what I'm doing is maybe a little bit different than the promissory note that I gave you earlier on at the description of the talk, because I'm not actually going to offer very much analysis today. That is, maybe you came because you wanted to hear some explanations of why violence was taking place in southern Thailand or Myanmar, but I'm not really going to answer that question for you, at least not in the presentation. Instead, though, what I hope that I'm able to do is paint some pictures, give you some historical vignettes, maybe, and add some layers of complexity as you think about the issue, so that perhaps you'll have some tools to engage in at least some rudimentary analysis yourself of the situation. So if you've been following the Southeast Asian news really for the last 5 or 6 years, then you have probably been confronted with images like this. So we have Buddhist monks who are leading protests, who are shouting slogans, who have signs that say things like Muslims go home or Muslims get out. And for those of us who maybe have a somewhat sterilized view of the Buddhist faith through maybe popular American culture, this really doesn't resonate with what we think about when we think about Buddhism. We think instead of peaceful, saffron-clad monks walking quietly. We imagine ascetics practicing by themselves on some mountaintop in a quest for enlightenment, wishing peace on all sentient beings. And that's certainly part of Buddhism, But that's not the only part of Buddhism, because one of the things that we have to remember is that it's a religion. And as a religion, it gets bound up in other factors like identity, national movements, and ethnic movements as well. And so I'm hoping that I'll paint a bit of a picture for you that's going to be complicated, but I'm not really going to be doing much of the analysis for you. Instead, it's really going to be up to you to take the information that I present you and to think about it. And so I'm afraid I'll try to make sure that I leave time for the question and answer, but I've got a lot that I'm going to go through. And I'm going to do it mostly by telling stories. Like maybe some of you here, I'm a hillbilly, right? And part of my culture is telling stories, right? Is spinning yarns. And as a philosopher come historian, that's part of what we do. And also what you're going to be presented with is a bit piecemeal. And this mirrors the sort of research that we do when we're a historian, right? When we begin looking at a particular issue, it's not given to us all at once. Instead, we really have to connect the dots. We see, I find this inscription over here, or I find out that in this particular year this happened, or maybe this person who was involved in this later on is involved in that. And so as historians, we begin having to sort of put these pieces together. And so that is in part the challenge that I'm giving you. Now, I'm going to be talking about Theravada Buddhism. So Theravada Buddhism is the Buddhism that is practiced primarily in Sri Lanka, Burma, or Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia today. And there are pockets of practice in the diaspora elsewhere. And Theravada has a long history of being involved in violence. This is not an exhaustive list, but this gives you some indication of the different times and different locations in which Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism specifically, has been enmeshed in violence. So we have the conquest of Ilaria in about 161 BCE by the Sinhalese king Dutta Amagami, where he, in the Mahavamsa, the Chronicle of Sri Lanka that tells us this story, killed millions of Tamils in order to unify the island of Sri Lanka under the Buddha Dharma, and is very explicit. I'm not doing this for gold or glory. I am doing this to bring the Buddhist teaching to the entire land of Sri Lanka. We have the invasion of Suvarnabhumi in 1057. This is an invasion of the Burmese, of a Mon polity that we believe that exists. Why? Well, because the Mons wouldn't give the Burmese a copy of the Tripitaka, of the Buddhist canon. So instead, the Burmese sack the city of Suvarnabhumi, carry off the entire Mon population back to the kingdom of Bagan, enslave them all, and the highlight of this adventure is carrying back their 22 copies of the Buddhist canon on the backs of white elephants. And so, if we jump to modern times, we see the anti-Muslim riots in Rangoon in 38. We see the Khmer Republic's resistance of the Khmer Rouge, in which, and also in Thailand, the resistance of the communists, in which we had Buddhist actors saying, look, it's okay to kill communists because the communists want to overthrow Buddhism. They're not Buddhists. They're atheists. They're damn Tamil. Tamil is of course you can hear Tamil from the ethnic group of Sri Lanka, but it also came to mean atheist in the Cambodian language. The Sri Lankan Civil War that ended only in 2009 with great loss of life. If we jump forward to 2013, there was a bomb plot, a Muslim bomb plot to bomb the Myanmar embassy in Jakarta. And this is really fascinating. The bombers, it's like from a movie. The bombers were actually stopped by the Indonesian police on their motorcycles with the bombs strapped to their backs as they drove to the embassy. So they were sort of caught in the nick of time. Of course, you probably remember the bombing of Bodh Gaya. Bodh Gaya is the most sacred site of Buddhism, probably. It's in India, and a number of bomb explosions went off on June 17th in 2013. In part, probably because of a reprisal of some of the contemporary violence in Myanmar. There was an assassination attempt of some Burmese Muslim politicians in Malaysia in 2014. And so as we see, there's been this long relationship of Buddhism and violence in South and Southeast Asia. Now today I'm going to be talking about two conflicts specifically and two histories. Of course, I can't paint the entire history. I can't tell you, going back from time immemorial about these. But we're going to be looking at Myanmar, but specifically Arakan, this state that is very, very close to Bangladesh, and then Patani in southern Thailand, right on the Malaysia-Thailand border. And so what I'm going to do is provide a little bit of historical background about both of these conflicts that I hope will help us understand the contemporary situation a little bit better, even though I'm going quite far back in the past. And so I'm going to begin with the story of Naramekla. So Naramekla was an Arakanese king. He was born in about 1380, and when he was 24 years old, before he ascended the kingship, he fled Arakan State, in part because of intrigues at the court between essentially the Burmese kingdom, which was then centered in the middle dry zone of Burma in Bagan, and the court at Pagan. So he basically flees for his life from Arakan. This is a picture of Arakan, and as you can see, it has sort of a unique geography. It's open to the Bay of Bengal, so it's sort of always been opened to maritime trade and to connections across the Bay of Bengal. But it's ridged by the Arakan Yoma, or the Arakan mountain range. So it's difficult to cross from mainland Burma into this coastal area. So in a way, it was insulated. Now, the kingdom goes back probably to the Rakhine people probably arrived there sometime around the 10th century. They're a Tibeto-Burman people, and they displaced the people that were earlier there. So Naramekla has to flee because of the intrigues at the court. And where does he go? He flees to the Sultanate of Gaur. He flees to the Sultanate of Bengal. So at this time, the Sultanate of Bengal is ruled by Ilyas Shah, who is a vassal of the Mughals in India. So it's an Islamic state. It's an Islamic sultanate. Now, while he is there, Ilyas Shah is overthrown by what was the treasurer of the kingdom, of the sultanate, who was himself a Hindu, Ganesh Raja. So Naramekla spends actually 20 years in this Islamic court as a refugee. So Raja Ganesha overthrows the kingdom and becomes the king, but there's almost immediately an invasion by another nearby sultanate who are incensed that a Hindu has gained power in what was an Islamic sultanate. And so there's an Islamic army is sent to try to displace this Bangladeshi Hindu lord who's overthrown the kingdom. Naramekla, it is said, provides sort of invaluable assistance in this conflict. And Raja Ganesha manages to repel the Hindu invaders, and he brokers a deal with the ruling Turco-Persian ruling class, the Muslim ruling class, so that his son converts to Islam and assumes the throne. But in part, in gratitude for the assistance that Naramekla has provided him, he agrees to restore Naramekla to the kingdom of Arakan, to the kingship. And so what happens at the 3 years before the end of Naramekla's reign, oh, that's not working. 3 years before the end of Naramekla's reign, so at 1433, he is restored to the Sultanate by an Islamic army. Now, at this time, he establishes a new Buddhist dynasty. So there has been some debate among scholars. Some scholars thought that maybe Naramekla converted to Islam. Why? Well, because he begins using Islamic titles. Coins begin being cast in the Persian language, and they actually contain the Shahada. They actually contain the Muslim confession of faith on the coins. But we have other evidence, including the observations of an early Portuguese traveler that makes it pretty clear that actually he did not convert to Islam himself, but there's a strong Islamic influence that begins being exerted in Arakan as well. So this is an inscription that I took a photograph of. I sent it to a Persian scholar. He could only read the first few words, and so he's not sure whether the rest is actually in Persian or maybe it's in Bengali, but he wasn't actually able to make it out. But the beginning is definitely in Persian. So this is an inscription from this particular time period. Now, Naramekla also builds a mosque called the Sandikan Mosque. And I went looking for that mosque this summer, and this pile of rubble is what I believe was the Sandikan Mosque. Evidently, it was standing until the 1980s, and then it was deliberately destroyed. So this 15th century mosque was deliberately destroyed. And I had a really interesting experience at the Archaeological Society of Mrapu, which is where this was. They found out that I could read Sanskrit, and so I spent the afternoon with them handing me gold coin after gold coin with Sanskrit inscriptions to see if I could make out the inscriptions. So I asked them, where is the Sandikan Mosque? And they said, it's somewhere. We don't really know. There was a mosque at one time, and so I used a hand-drawn map by Pamela Gutman, who herself never actually saw the mosque. She was there in 2002, and through her informants, sort of figured out where it is. So I think that this was the Sandikan Mosque. So we have this really early Islamic presence in Arakan State. So we're going to jump forward. Now we jump forward to around 1616. And the Portuguese and the VOC, or the Dutch Indian Company, in Arakan. So Arakan becomes really a thriving port on the Bay of Bengal. It's up the Caledon River, so it actually probably takes by boat at that time 4 or 5 hours to go upriver, and the Caledon River is a very nice wide river. Large ships could come in, so it was really an excellent port. It's inland enough that it can be sort of protected, but it's also open to the ocean. And so this is a Dutch painting that's taken from one of the promenades of Arakan, and so you can see it really is sort of a bustling town. Here you can see this would be the palace, and you can see the ramparts that used to surround the city. So it was a very, very well fortified city. And in fact, if you visit it today, you can still see sort of the remainders of the ramparts that surround the city, and the platform where the palace stood is still visible. And so the Portuguese arrive quite early, like everywhere else in Southeast Asia, right? The Portuguese show up and they begin trade relations. But it's not long after the Portuguese show up that the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, shows up. And of course, by this time, the Dutch East India Company has already established itself in the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia. And what the Dutch were after, of course, were spices. And so, very famously, they took the island of Ambon, which was the one place in the world where nutmeg was produced. And because the people were being a little recalcitrant in harvesting it and selling it to the Dutch slaughtered the entire population of the island. The Dutch completely depopulated it. They kill everyone on the island. The only Ambonese that survive are ones that managed to escape. And so what the Dutch essentially did was eliminate their labor force. And so, if it's the 17th century and you need cheap labor, what do? Well, you find slaves. Exactly. And so, the Arakanese, along with their Portuguese partners, become very successful slavers. Now, slave is sort of a loaded term, because when we hear slave, we have associations with the Western tradition and the experience particularly of the enslaved Africans being brought to the United States or being brought to the Caribbean. Slavery works a little differently. Not that it's any better in Southeast Asia. But, for example, Southeast Asian war was really about manpower rather than territory. So you have war, so you can go in somewhere, you can capture a lot of people, you can bring them back. They're slaves, but essentially what you do is you use them to open up new lands of cultivation. So you put them to work, and usually eventually they get integrated into society in some way. So I like to use the term trafficked peoples, right? Because it has a little more ambiguity and it also sort of reflects what's happening. So the Arakanese people, along with basically Portuguese collaborators who in part have shown them how to make better ships and also are providing arms to them, begin slave raiding all along the Bengalese coast and upriver in Bengal. So you have these Arakanese who are speakers of a Tibeto-Burmese language, right? They practice Buddhism as their religion, and they are slave raiding people who are ethnically Bengali. So coastal raids or upriver raids, and we even have evidence now from Dutch VOC records that we know that they specifically targeted communities that were known for weaving because they wanted to establish a native weaving industry. And so what happened was these slaves were brought in, and then many of them were trafficked on to the Dutch VOC and went to the Dutch East Indies to work as plantation laborers on islands in present-day Indonesia. So we have some observations, and it's cut off a little bit here. Talish was a Persian who visited the Sultanate of Bengal as well as Arakan, and he observed that it's really here in Bengal. This is the place where Muslims are being subjugated by an infidel king. And what he's referring to are the slave raids. And so he also observes slaves that are being taken into Arakan. And so he describes a practice whereby these Bengalis have their hands pierced, the skin between their thumb and their finger, and a rope is run through it. And so you have slaves, you have women, children, and men who have ropes strung through their hands, and this is how they're being transported. Now, Major Brown, who's there much, much later, in 1777, observes that the Arakanese just this past month bring in 1,800 slaves in 1 month. Now, what's happening is part of these are being trafficked on to the VOC, and the numbers that are being trafficked over to the VOC change according to years. There's a couple of periods of almost 10 years where the Dutch sort of stopped buying Arakanese slaves, but then they return and begin purchasing them again. But it's really the sheer amount of people who are being trafficked by Arakan that is most astounding. Now, by this time, actually by around 1693, the king of Arakan institutes a new tariff whereby 1/4 of all slaves or all trafficked people become property of the crown. So before he was taxing this, and individuals were being sold both to Arakanese people as well as to the Dutch VOC and other traders, but from that point on, 1/4 of the trafficked people remain. All skilled artisans, no matter what the tariff, remain. So people who have skills like construction or weavers or blacksmiths all become property of the Arakanese king. Now, I have a statistic here that Michael Charney, maybe I included it here. Major Brown, so Major Brown, continuing this observation, notes that in 1777, 3/4 of the inhabitants of Arakan are these Bengalis, are trafficked people. So by this point of time, we have a large population of people who are chattel, who do not have political rights, who are owned by other people and who are primarily engaged in either labor for the state or in agricultural labor, not as free agents, right? These are not free individuals. These are trafficked people. So Michael Charney estimates that by this period, there's been about 186,000 Bengalis that have been trafficked through Arakan. And if we take this up to the Battle of Plessy, where the British gained control over Bengal, over present-day Bangladesh, it's likely that 250,000 more Bangladeshis were trafficked through Arakan. Now, who are these Bangladeshis? Well, many of them are Muslim. Many of them are Hindu as well. It seems that the individuals who were Hindu culturally sort of disappeared, either through conversion to Islam or conversion to Buddhism. But we don't see a strong Hindu identity maintained throughout time. But what we do find is that the Muslim Bengalis managed to maintain their separate identity as Muslims through time. So, 1777, perhaps, according to the observations of some, 3/4 of the population are trafficked people in this particular state, Bengali trafficked people. Even if that's an overestimate, still by this time, probably 300,000 people have been trafficked through Arakan. If we expect that about 1/4 of them stayed, and with demographic change, we should really expect that by this time, by 1978, there would be a population of about 250,000 people who are descendants of these trafficked people. So in 1978, I'm not going to talk very much about what happened in 1978, but this is a headline. This is a headline from May 15th that appeared in the Dawn. Looks familiar, doesn't it? Genocide of Muslim minority in Burma. Armed Bangladeshi bands attacking Burmese. So what happened in 1978 is the Burmese government did a crackdown on illegal Bangladeshis. Now, who are these illegal Bangladeshis? Well, if you listen to Rakhine politicians, everyone who is Bengali snuck into the country. It's unfortunately not an exaggeration. And so what happened in 78 is there was action taken against Bengali populations who were identified as being illegal immigrants. What happened is fuzzy, right? What happened is fuzzy. So the Burmese army essentially begins attacking these Bengali people in order to drive them back into Bangladesh, saying that they're illegal immigrants. The Burmese then accuse these Bengali people of also attacking Burmese troops. But what happens is an incredible refugee crisis where 200,000 ethnic Bengalis flee from Myanmar into Bangladesh. And so by this time, there are 200,000 refugees in camps in Bangladesh. Now, today, most people use the term Rohingya. And Rohingya refers to Arakanese who are of Bangladeshi origin. And this is a very contested term. This is a very contested term. So, in order to sort of understand this contestation, we will turn to the present cycle of violence. You might not want to see the image that's coming next. If you're squeamish, you don't want to see it. It's very disturbing. And I'm not going to keep it up very long, but I think that it's important. It's important that we actually look at this image. It's gone. That young woman was raped and murdered. Her name was Ma. And the story is that she was gang raped and murdered by 3 Bangladeshis. And her death, in part, set off the latest cycle of violence that really began in 2012 and continues today. And this is a story that gets repeated again and again. This is how you incite violence in Myanmar. You say this good Buddhist woman was raped by them. And this is enough to spark violence. So the first outbreak was a bus was stopped in Arakan State. 20 Muslim men were escorted off the bus and were killed execution style by a Buddhist mob. And the reprisal killings continued. Now, this image that we saw a moment ago that's so disturbing, the Arakan Ethnic Party, the Rakhine Ethnic Party, published a calendar that year with photographs from Ma's life, her posing in dresses, and the last 6 months of that calendar are photos like that, are photos from her death. And the same organization, their newspaper, stated that sometimes genocide is acceptable if it protects the native peoples. So this is the village on Rami Island that was destroyed. This is a place that's about 20 kilometers from Mrak-U, which was completely torched by a Buddhist mob. In this particular case, the state newspaper reported that the Muslims all set fire to their own homes and to the mosque before fleeing to the refugee camps. That no Buddhist had anything to do with this. No Buddhist had anything to do with this. This is also from the ethnic party's newspaper. This fellow is supposed to be a Bangladeshi. And this fellow is a Rakhine person. And so the Bangladeshis are trying to wrest Rakhine State away from the Rakhine people. And so when I was in Myanmar this summer, all Muslims are in camps or are in Muslim quarters. They are not allowed to leave. They're there for their own protection. They're under guard. Other individuals are not allowed to come in without a permit. And so they're behind barbed wire in what are essentially open prisons. And now we jump across the Isthmus of Kra. So now you have to set aside everything that I had to say about Rakhine and Arakan, the Burmese situation. And now we're going to look, not in quite so much depth, but at the conflict in Patani. So this is a map of Patani Dharamsala. This is what was the Sultanate of Patani. Patani was a Malay sultanate. So in case you don't know, Malaysia is actually composed of a number of sultanates that were put together in the Union of Malaya by the British. Right? Before the advent of colonialism, Kedah, Patani, Terengganu, Johor, these were all independent Muslim sultanates, Malay Muslim sultanates. So Patani is established in about the mid-13th century or early 14th century as an independent sultanate. By 1511, the Portuguese are there, so we have early Portuguese reports of Patani from around 1511. By 1538, visitors are reporting that there's a really large Japanese population here. There are lots of Japanese traders. And in fact, in 1592, Patani establishes direct diplomatic relations with Japan. So the Japanese send a trade emissary to Patani at this time, and Patani sends a trade emissary in 1592 to the Japanese. 1641, the Dutch are there, and so it really is a thriving town. And so this is a picture of two gold coins from early Patani. You can sort of make out the bull, right, if you look closely. And then we have some Arabic script here. The Patani Malays were bad neighbors, we could say. So just north of them, of course, is the Thai state that sort of at the beginning of this period is based in Ayutthaya, the old Thai capital. And the Thais, of course, don't have, the Patani Malays are not the only bad neighbors that the Thais have. There's also the Burmese. And if you know anything about Southeast Asian history, you know that the Korat Plateau is basically, the history of the Korat Plateau is basically the history of Thai and Burmese wars. So what happens is in 1563, the Burmese invade and surround the Thai, the Siamese capital. And so the Patani Malays take the initiative and they send 200 warships to also help the Burmese and to fight the Thai. And so as it turns out, this is pretty successful. The Thais have to flee Ayutthaya. The Burmese manage to sack it. But this, of course, creates sort of an undying ire between the Siamese state and their southern Malayu neighbor. And so what happens over the next few hundred years is essentially a number of conflicts, a sort of tit for tat. This is usually called in English the 300-year mosque. So this is it's the oldest mosque in Thailand. It's one of the oldest wooden mosques in the world. It's been in continuous use since the early 17th century. And it really is a symbol of the Patani Sultanate for the people. So in 1603, the Siamese invade, but they are fended off. And part of the reason why the Patani Malays are able to resist the Siamese invasion, even though the army of the Thais is much larger, is because Patani has very good trade relations. And so they have something that the Thais do not: modern weapons, cannons, and arms. And so it's interesting, sort of 15 years after this battle happens, an emissary from the Siamese kingdom comes to see if they can purchase any weapons from the Patanis. And the Patanis probably very wisely decline to sell the Thais any of these cannons that were so helpful before. So in 1632, there's another Thai attack that's fended off. The following year, there's a third Thai attack that the Patani Malayus managed to fend off. And then we jump forward about 100 years to 1776, there is again another Burmese invasion. And so the Burmese are at the gates of the Siamese capital, and the Siamese king, the Siamese Raja, sends to request aid from the Patani Malayus, and they refuse. And at the end of this conflict, the Thais this time sort of managed to more successfully repel the Burmese, but the Thais determined that they have had enough of the intransient of their southern neighbor, and decide that they are going to launch really an invasion that will be capable of taking Patani. Now, this, Christopher, you may have actually seen this before. This sits in front of the Thai defense industry, which is just across the street from the royal capital. This particular cannon is the Sri Patani. It's the Great Patani. So this is one of three enormous, this is a huge cannon, one of three cannons that were forged within Patani itself in order to resist the Siamese. And in the last Siamese invasion, the Siamese are victorious. They managed to subjugate the Patanis because they were betrayed by a Thai trader who showed up penniless and destitute and was taken in by the Patani Malayus and then betrayed them by revealing the secrets of their defense to the Thai general. And so this is part of the reason why he was able to take the capital. So Patani is defeated, and the Sri Patani is hauled back to Bangkok as a symbol of that conquest. And so Patani Malayus today, when they go to Bangkok, go to visit this temple. Barbara Andaya has a really nice article about sort of the almost supernatural aura that this particular cannon had for the Patani people at that time. So the Patanis tried to resist again. So just south of Patani, if you remember, there was another sultanate named Kedah. So it's actually in the 19th century, the early 19th century. I'm sorry, the end of the 17th century. The Sultan of Kedah dies, and there is no immediately apparent heir. And so the Siamese take this as an opportunity to invade Kedah. And so Kedah, the Malays of Kedah, resist this invasion by the Thai. The Malacca and Johor also lend their support, as does the Sultanate of Kelantan. And the Patani Malayus raise up in revolt in solidarity with their Muslim Malay brothers to the south. So at that point, the government of Patani is replaced by essentially a Thai puppet government. And this lasts for about 10 years. And then the governor that has been appointed, the puppet governor, somehow has a turn of heart. So part of the reason that we know of this is a text called the Hikyat Patani Malayu, or the history of Malay Patani, that was written by, we actually don't know who. We don't know who wrote this. But it was in about the 1940s. And so it has a very sort of nationalistic strain to it already. But his explanation was that this puppet governor actually was a good-hearted man and saw the suffering of the Patani Malayus and couldn't take it anymore. And so he too leads a rebellion against the Siamese government, but that is crushed. And so the Sultanate of Patani remains an autonomous zone, but becomes a tributary of the Siamese and is not allowed to engage in any foreign diplomatic relations except through Thailand. The governor's actually abortive result was revealed because he sent a letter to the King of Amman, to the Vietnamese emperor, and said, if you invade from the north, I'll invade from the south, and let's see what we can do. But the Vietnamese turned the letter over to the Thais, and so they discovered his treachery. If you listen to the news today, you hear almost weekly bombings in southern Thailand. Almost weekly bombings. This is a bombing that took place in Hat Yai, which is one of the larger cities in southern Thailand. So there has been actually sporadic violence in southern Thailand, sporadic successionist violence in southern Thailand. That really stretches back. I mean, there were incidents in the 40s. There was really a pretty solid movement in the 1970s. And then things quieted down, only to resume at a sort of low level in 2007. But then in October 2008, there was an event that really reignited the conflict. So 2 Malay Muslim men had been arrested by the Thai police and were being held in a rural police station. And a crowd of Muslim men gathered outside demanding that they be released. And so the police called in backup, and these men were literally stacked on top of each other in the backs of trucks in the October monsoon heat in Thailand. And 80 Muslim men suffocated to death in police custody from being piled on top of one another. Now, perhaps there could have been some saving grace. The Thais acknowledged that this happened, but Thaksin, who was the prime minister at the time, issued an explanation and said, "This is common practice. We didn't do anything wrong, but because it was Ramadan, they were fasting, and so they died from weakness of hunger. Not because that they were stacked on top of each other, but instead put the blame on the practice of fasting in the Ramadan." And so, sort of needless to say, this exasperated the problem. And so today, this conflict, as I said, weekly there are bombings in southern Thailand. In the past few months, there's been bombings outside of southern Thailand, which leads to a fear of perhaps some escalation of this violence. But only time will tell, right? And so this is an image of the Emerald Buddha. And so if you've been to the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, then you have seen this. And it's an emblem of the Thai state. To be Thai is to speak Thai, to be ethnically Thai, and to be a Buddhist. And this is in part represented by the Emerald Buddha, which the Thai carried back after conquering the Laotian kingdom. So, thank you very much.
Time for questions?
Yes.
So, going back to the Rohingya conflict, or the oppression of the Rohingyas, there's a lot of use of the word genocide in this, and according to the legal international standard, genocide is to destroy an ethnic, religious, or lingual group, I think, based in whole or in part, with the intent to destroy them. Based on like a certain number of criteria. One of those criteria is removing children from their mothers, or somehow stopping the growth of this group, right? From my knowledge about the Rohingya conflict, one of the main ways that the Myanmar government is using in order to sort of suppress the Rohingya is through delegitimizing, through being very controlling of their marriage, as well as being controlling of like citizenship practices. Like many of these Rohingya are not considered citizens.
Right. None of them are actually considered, or very few of them are considered citizens. Very few. And also they have been targeted by what are known as the Protection of Religion Acts. Mm-hmm. So the Protection of Religion Acts passed through the National Parliament. They're now the law of the land in Myanmar. And so they're essentially restrictions on potential miscegenation. So, for example, if a Buddhist woman wants to marry a Muslim man, she must post a notice of her intent to marry in the village where she resides. And if any Buddhist man objects based upon that notice, she is unable to be married. There's also the population control laws that have been passed, which are very, very vaguely written. And so essentially what this law says is if the state determines that population growth is outpacing resources in any area of the union, they can require that all women wait at least 36 months between bearing children. And most people think that this is really clearly aimed at the Rohingya people because in part they have a higher fertility rate than the Arakanese people that are around them. And so these protection of marriage acts were really pushed by, not entirely by the Arakanese people, but by really a right-wing Buddhist movement that is called Mabata in Myanmar. And it's very nationalistic, it's very right. It has its origins actually in the Obama movement. So much of their platform echoes exactly the kind of rhetoric that one heard in the 1938 anti-Muslim riots. That Burma is a Burmese kingdom, and there's really only a place for, that Burma is a Burmese kingdom, and it is a Buddhist kingdom. It's a Buddhist nation, and there's really only places for Buddhists. And so intermarriage threatens Buddhism.
Thank you.
So the first picture of your presentation were a bunch of monks and a rally or
Yes.
things like. So do monks also take in arms during these civil unrests?
No. So there have been almost no documented cases of monks being engaged in violence. What we have, though, are monks inciting violence and justifying violence. And so what you have are very, very prominent monks, like members of the Mabata group, who are being put on television, being put in nationalist papers, producing YouTube videos, and where they say things like, these Muslims are a vermin, they're a plague, they're an infection, they need to be cut out, they need to be weeded out, they're destroying the land of the Buddha, they are destroying the Buddha Dharma, they want your women, they want your sisters, they want your wives, they're rapists, they're murderers, they're illegal immigrants. And so you have monks who are projecting this type of rhetoric, and then they're saying, and if someone were to get rid of them all, the Buddha would understand. And so it really is very much like that. So what they're doing is they're laying the rhetorical precursors of violence, as well as providing a quasi-Buddhist justification for that violence. And so as a result, you have people who are acting violently towards Muslims that actually don't see any sort of ethical problem with it at all. You know, one of the most disappointing things in my interviews, so I spent 2 weeks in Arakan State this last summer doing interviews, and I kept expecting to hear some Buddhist voice that would say, yeah, this is wrong. People, they shouldn't be treated that way. But instead, I talked to monks who said they're beasts. They're not human. They're the same as dogs, and they should be treated like dogs. They should be rounded up and put away like dogs. And so when your moral leaders are telling you this, it's not violence itself, but it certainly is enabling violence.
Was there anything that happened in Myanmar and Bangladesh when they were part of the British Empire that exacerbated the tension between the two groups?
Yes. So one of the things in 1930 and in 1938 there were race riots in Myanmar. The 1930 race riot is usually referred to as the anti-Indian race riot, and the 1938 race riot is usually called the anti-Muslim race riot. In part, the anti-Indian race riot really developed because a large number of Indian immigrants, primarily Tamil and Telugu people, had come into the city of Rangoon, and basically they were snapping up all the unskilled labor. And so Fight at the Docks between some Burmese men and some Telugu dock workers spirals out of control and becomes a citywide riot in which Indians are being targeted. So these are, it's a common problem. Large number of immigrants come into a nation, and the people of that nation suddenly feel threatened by these foreigners that are coming in and taking their jobs. And so there was this reaction. So there was this exasperation, the freedom of movement from India to Bangladesh. But also, and this is, I think, important, but we can't bring it all out here, the Bangladeshis have often been thought of, or these descendants of Bangladeshis, these Rohingya people, have often been thought of by the Burmese and the Arakanese as a third colony. And so, in World War II, and this is what my summer research will be looking at, in World War II, there was a massacre of Bengali people. So as the British, of course, were driven out by the Japanese of Burma, and so the British retreated from Burma. So we have accounts. We just have one account from a journalist an Australian fellow named William Mundy, who was there, and the dispatch is great. It says from somewhere in Burma. And he describes a massacre that's happening of Muslims by the Burmese who have been armed by the Japanese. And so the Buddhist Burmese, or these are actually going to be Arakanese, most likely, are killing the Muslims because the Muslims are seen to be, well, the justification is that they're British sympathizers, right? But in reality, what they are is a dispossessed class, right? I mean, this should not be very surprising for us given the American experience. I mean, if you turn on the news today and we hear one story after another of young African American men being killed by police, right? We don't have equal rights for people of color who in the United States are often the descendants of a trafficked population. Burma hasn't had any civil rights movement yet. There hasn't been a civil rights movement. And yet there is this large population of trafficked people who have traditionally been politically disenfranchised, have been economically disenfranchised, haven't had recourse to any sort of arbitration of their problems, but really have been for centuries victims of the dominant population. And so Rakhine people, who in part are striving for as much political autonomy as possible, given that it looks very possible that federalism will prevail in Myanmar, don't want their voice as an ethnic group to be diluted by these Muslim peoples who are most likely going to side with the dominant Burmese, because the hope is that the dominant Burmese will be able to provide at least some physical protection against the Rakhines, who they can't have any sort of trust or certainty in now. But whether that will happen, I mean, it doesn't look like the Burmese have been a friend of the Rakhine people. It doesn't look like Aung San Suu Kyi has been a friend of the Rakhine people. It's so disheartening. It's Aung San Suu Kyi. We all hear that she's trying, but in my perspective, it's sort of like Nelson Mandela was elected president and he decided to keep apartheid. It's that sort of difference. And so she keeps begging for time, but I think that the Rohingya people really feel betrayed that something hasn't happened, and they're still living in these open air prisons.
What is the international reaction been both towards the situation in Burma and Thailand? Both from I'm interested from Western countries' perspectives, but also the Islamic world.
Well, the reaction from the Islamic world has been very, very interesting. So last year, Iran held a conference and brought together Muslim leaders and Buddhist leaders from around the world in Tehran to try to essentially start a kind of peace process. If you read the press out of the Middle East or out of Turkey, This is really presented as, look at the plight of these poor Muslim people. We need to do more to help them. ISIS in India has issued a pledge that they will carry on jihad into Burma in order to protect their Muslim brothers and sisters. The bomb plot that I talked about a little bit earlier, the bombing of the Myanmar embassy and the bombing of Bodh Gaya, were both Muslim reactions to the violence against the Rohingya people. So there's certainly an interest, but I don't know. My sense is the international community says, "Oh, Burma again. How many ethnic conflicts how many people are there that you can have an ethnic conflict with?" And so it's just sort of more of the same. Although, there's really kind of intense interest because these people have been concentrated, right? And that's a very, very dangerous thing. When people lose the freedom of movement and they all become concentrated in one place, that's sort of very alarming. And so I think the UN has been very proactive in trying to, get aid. I'm in contact with some people who visit the camps almost every week to see the aid is being distributed and things like this to the Rohingya people. But at the same time, the Burmese government can cut that off, right? So they expelled Doctors Without Borders because they thought that they were favoring the Rohingya people rather than also serving the Burmese community. And I think that with the Thai conflict, I don't want to go on, but I think with the Thai conflict that there's sort of this general sense of relief that it hasn't been tied into international Islam, right? That it has remained really a local conflict and doesn't have any sort of overtly jihadi kind of flavor to it. It doesn't look like these Malays that are involved in this conflict are talking to, Abu Saif in the Philippines, or they're not talking to Indonesian terrorist groups. It really does seem self-contained, and the goal is political autonomy, right? In the 20s and in the 30s, when Malaysia was actually being formed, later on in the 60s, the Patani Malays circulated a petition and asked us to join Malaysia. And so I think that for many of them, that would be sort of the ideal situation. Real quick.
Yeah. So you sort of talked a little bit about not having yet had a civil rights movement. What kind of social organizing for marginalized groups in these areas is going on?
They have ethnic armies. So the Karen people have their own ethnic army. The Kachin people have the Kachin Independence Army. The Arakanese have the Arakan Army. And so it's really being played out not in terms of sort of ground root civil rights movement, but it's being played out in terms of armed conflict. And so right now there's a major sort of peace deal that's being discussed. Not all of the armed ethnic armies have agreed to participate. Those that do are rather sort of tenuous. But Burma has been in ethnic civil war essentially since its creation. And so because there's armed conflict that has been more or less continuous, there's not really the social space to talk about Kachin people or Wu people or Mon people having the same rights as the Burmese, who essentially dominate the country through the Tatmadaw, through the Burmese army. And so the army is really the one institution that has sort of lasted in Myanmar, and as you can guess, civil rights movement is probably unlikely to come from an ethnic army.
At this point, please join me in thanking Jared Brown.